We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. We have ignition.
हम ज़मीन के रहने वालों की तरफ से आपको खुश आमदीद कहते हैं।
Hola y saludos a todos.
Greetings and friendly wishes to all who may encounter this Voyager and receive this message.
Hello.
We step into the universe with humility and hope.
Hello from the children, from the children of planet Earth. Hello, konnichiwa. Hello from the children of planet Earth. Hello from the children. From the children. Hello. Hello from the children. From the children.
Hello, greetings mga ka-spacers natin out there from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And sa lahat po ng ating mga ka-spacers na nakatutok at nanonood po ngayon worldwide and netwide, magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. This is your ka-spacer and space commander, Professor Jun Cajigal, welcoming you to another episode of COSMOQUEST, a podcast. So for this episode mga ka-spacers, very interesting po ang ating topic ngayon. So we will be discussing the space station. So ito po yung isa sa mga dahilan kung bakit hindi na po nakabalik ang mga astronauts sa buwan after Apollo 17. Because of the changing priorities of the United States government, na-cancel po yung Apollo 18. And the United States government focused their attention on the development of the space station and yung space shuttle. Now, bakit kaya nakita nila yung halaga ng space station? Now, the space station has made it possible for people to have an ongoing presence in space at yun po ang gusto ng United States government. The space station's laboratories will allow also the crew members to do research that could not be done anywhere else. So gusto nilang mag-research sa zero gravity, no? So kaya gusto nilang i-develop ang space station and eventually also yung development ng space shuttle. So ayan po yung ating pag-uusapan ngayong gabi dito sa episode ng COSMOQuest, the space station. So habang nakikinig po kayo, if you have any comments or questions or reactions dito sa ating pag-uusapan ngayon, please feel free to type in your questions, your comments, or your reactions in our comment section below mga ka-spacers. And also, please like and share this episode of COSMOQuest so that we could reach more people, lalong-lalo na po yung mga estudyante, so that we could inspire them to be engaged in the sciences, especially astronomy. So yun po, huwag niyo pong kalilimutan mga ka-spacers, bilang tulong niyo na rin po sa amin yan to like and share this episode of COSMOQuest. And also mga ka-spacers, don't forget to like and follow us on our Facebook page, the Tibetan Society of Young Astronomers. Please follow us also on our Facebook page, the Sky Watcher Society of Las Piñas. And also don't forget mga ka-spacers to follow me on my Facebook page, the Science Guy Ka-Spacers channel. And also may YouTube channel po ko mga ka-spacers. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Science Guy Professor Jun Cajigal. Please click on that notification bell so that you would be updated on our future videos. Alright mga ka-spacers, wag na natin patagalin ito and let us learn about the space station and its significance. So let's go mga ka-spacers. Hello, greetings and good day. So for our online lecture, we will be focusing on the space station. And many would say that the space station is the future of space exploration. So for our topic tonight, we will be zooming in on the benefits of having a space station. So before we proceed into the details of our lecture tonight, probably we have to define what a space station is. Now, basically, a space station is an artificial structure usually in orbit around the Earth that is designed for humans to live and work in outer space for a certain period of time. Now, to distinguish a space station from other manned spacecraft, basically, a space station is distinguished from other manned spacecraft by its lack of major propulsion or landing facilities. Instead, those other manned spacecraft or vehicles, they are used as transport to and from the station. Now, the concept of the space station can be traced way back during the 1950s when Wernher von Braun, an American space pioneer, had ideas for a large orbiting space station. He envisioned a wheel-shaped facility like the one in the picture, slowly rotating to provide artificial gravity. So the rotation of this wheel-shaped facility will provide the centrifugal force that is needed to produce the artificial gravity inside the space station. Okay, and this wheel may have several thousand occupants. Alright, so this was the idea of Wernher von Braun of a wheel-shaped space station. And this space station rotates to produce artificial gravity via centrifugal force. So isn't that fascinating? So as far back as the 1950s, Wernher von Braun had already envisioned the space station. So my dear netizens, this was the dream of Wernher von Braun. He envisioned the future wherein space stations are in orbit around the Earth, where men and women can live and work in outer space. But that dream was sideswiped because of the space race and Project Apollo. Eventually, Wernher von Braun developed the Saturn V, which propelled man on the moon. Alright, so that was Wernher von Braun's idea of the space station. Now, the first space station was made actually by the Russians, and this was Salyut. Okay, Salyut was the first space station program undertaken by the Soviet Union. It involved a series of 4 crewed scientific research space stations and 2 crewed military reconnaissance space stations over a period of 15 years from 1971 to 1986. Now, the Russians constructed Salyut because of the reason that they wanted to carry out long-term research into the problems of living in space and a variety of astronomical, biological, and Earth resources experiments. And on the other hand, the USSR or the Soviet Union used this civilian program as a cover for the highly secretive military Almaz station, which flew under the Salyut designation. So that, my dear netizens, was Salyut, the first space station. Then came Skylab. Now, Skylab was the first United States space station launched by NASA and occupied for about 24 weeks between May 1973 and February of 1974. It was operated by 3 separate 3-astronaut crews like Skylab 2, Skylab 3, and Skylab 4. Major operations on Skylab included an orbital workshop, a solar observatory, Earth observation, and hundreds of experiments. So that was Skylab. And as a growing kid, I was really fascinated about this American space station simply because by the looks of it, Skylab appeared like a helicopter in orbit around the Earth. If we look closely at the solar panels, yung para siyang naka-X, those solar panels appeared like rotors of the helicopter. So, my impression as a growing kid is that Skylab is a huge helicopter in orbit around the Earth. And because of my fascination for Skylab, I actually made a model of the space station using recycled carton boxes. And I was really proud of my creation. In fact, dinadala ko pa yun sa school at pinagmamalaki ko sa aking mga classmates. And also what is so fascinating about Skylab is that how the American astronauts repaired the space station. Kasi nung nilaunch yan, nasira yan. If you will notice, kulang yan ng isang solar panel. And parang may natanggal na skin, a portion of the skin of the Skylab. So ang ginawa ng mga astronauts, nilagyan nila ng parang trapal or canopy, so that portion of the Skylab would be protected from the heat from the sun. Kasi parang natanggal yung balat niyan yung Skylab during launch. And they have to do something in order to compensate on the power generation of Skylab kasi natanggal nga yung isang solar panel. So I was really fascinated on how the American astronauts repaired the space station in orbit around the Earth. Alright, and Skylab orbited the Earth 2,476 times during the 171 days and 13 hours of its occupation during the 3 crewed Skylab expeditions. Skylab 2 lasted for 28 days, Skylab 3 lasted for 56 days, and Skylab 4 lasted for 84 days. Now, during the 3 crewed Skylab expeditions, Skylab had achieved the following. Now, the astronauts on board Skylab performed 10 spacewalks, totaling about 42 hours and 16 minutes. Skylab also logged about 2,000 hours of scientific and medical experiments. Also, 127,000 frames of film of the sun and 46,000 frames of the Earth was taken by Skylab. Remember, Skylab was an orbiting solar observatory and an orbiting Earth observation station. Solar experiments included photographs of 8 solar flares and produced valuable results that scientists stated would have been impossible to obtain with uncrewed spacecraft. The existence of the sun's coronal holes was confirmed because of these efforts. Many of the experiments conducted on board Skylab also investigated the astronauts' adaptation to extended periods of microgravity. So, isn't that fascinating about the achievements made by the astronauts on board the Skylab space station? So, here is a photo of the interior of Skylab, and here is the so-called shower section of the Skylab space station. And eventually, on July 11 of 1979, the abandoned Skylab returned to Earth, breaking up into the Earth's atmosphere, and the larger sections or pieces of the doomed Skylab fell to Earth somewhere near Australia. Alright, so that's Skylab. So let's watch this short video about this American space station Skylab. Alright, my dear netizens, let's watch this.
Skylab starts in the dreams of the people who wanted to go into space for a long time. Early in the 20th century, we saw people who were thinking about how do we get humanity off the planet Earth and into space.
There was a vision, a long-term vision humans had of exploring and going beyond, higher, farther, faster. There was the technical challenge, there was the scientific interest, there was the adventure, and there was just simply the demonstration of managerial and organizational and industrial economic competence in a world that was contested. So that was Skylab.
Throughout the 1960s, they looked at a number of different ways in which you could take the Apollo materials, particularly Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft, and do space station-like things with them. So by the end of the 1960s, 1969, right after the successes on the landing of the moon, attention turns to the space station program, and Skylab is really born there, being the program for human spaceflight during the early 1970s and to build our basis for experience and to address those important questions that we had, which were, could humans physiologically adapt to long periods of space? Early 1973, we get ready to launch Skylab. The Skylab Saturn V is sitting on one launch pad of the two launch pads we had for the Apollo program. Skylab is sitting on one launch pad, just a little ways away on the other launch pad is this Saturn I vehicle with the command and service module, because Skylab launches one day and the vehicle with the first crew was supposed to launch the next day.
3, 2, 1, 0, and we have a liftoff. The Skylab lifting off the pad now, moving up.
Unfortunately, when Skylab, the laboratory, goes up, the micrometeoroid shield that was on it that also provided heat protection for the vehicle rolls back, jams into the solar arrays. There are two big 5 kilowatt each solar arrays that we're supposed to deploy. Skylab gets in orbit, it's crippled. And we're in big trouble because Skylab needs that energy from those big solar arrays to operate and for the mission to be successful. And in 10 days, they quickly come up with a plan. We had people sew together a parasol sunshade that they could erect outside the station. They came up with some equipment that the crews could use to try and unstick the giant solar array that was stuck. And Pete Conrad and his crew, the first Skylab crew, go launch 10 days later and save the entire program. The $2.5 billion program would have gone down the drain if the crew hadn't gone up there and saved the mission.
Okay, we're free. We got 0.4 of a foot per second, Houston. Roger. Bye-bye, Skylab.
The story of the launch of the Skylab Orbital Workshop is one of those great triumphs of things going bad and engineers and humans and astronauts working together to fix them.
They have a very successful, almost month-long mission and proved that, in fact, first, that Skylab will work, that humans are really important to those things, and to get a lot of good scientific data. And of course, we had 2 more crews that launched later in the year. The second Skylab crew goes up for a longer period and does lots of Earth science experiments, lots of solar observations. And then the third crew finally launches at the end of 1973 and early into 74. They're up for almost 3 months. And they observe, do solar observations, do more Earth observations. We do experiments with students. The first NASA student experiments go on during Skylab. The last crew leaves Skylab in early 1974. So a very successful program overall, despite the fact that it almost, on the first minute of operations, almost went in the drink.
One of the real triumphs of Skylab is that it basically took a situation gathering both the limits of what was possible and the possibilities presented by incredible technological developments and put them together in a program that produced tremendous benefits in science, education, what spaceflight is all about. So it's a stepping stone. It was the stepping stone between the Apollo program and then later definitions of what spaceflight would mean for the United States.
Skylab is the first step. We learn how to operate in space. We build on that with the ISS. We now go on further beyond low Earth orbit to visit an asteroid and then on to Mars. That's the plan, and that's where we're going.
So mga ka-spacers, I hope you have learned a lot about Skylab through that short video. Skylab was the first American space station. Now, as a follow-up of Salyut, the Russians eventually developed the Mir space station. Now, the Mir space station was operated in low Earth orbit from 1986 to 2001. The Mir space station was operated by the then communist Soviet Union and later by Russia. And mga ka-spacers, did you know that the Mir space station was the first modular space station? Meaning, mga ka-spacers, Mir was assembled in Earth orbit from 1986 to 1996. So isn't that fascinating that the Mir space station was assembled in Earth orbit? It was the first modular space station, and it had a greater mass than any previous spacecraft developed. At that time, Mir was the largest artificial satellite in orbit, succeeded by the International Space Station or ISS after Mir's orbit decayed. And the station Mir served as a microgravity research laboratory in which the crew of the Mir station conducted experiments in biology, human biology, physics, astronomy, meteorology, and spacecraft systems with a goal of developing technologies required for permanent occupation of space. Alright mga ka-spacers, so to learn more about the Mir space station, let's watch this fascinating video about the Mir space station. So my dear ka-spacers, let's watch this.
35 years ago, the Soviet Union launched the core module of the Mir station. In today's video, we'll talk about the history of this space station and its contribution to our knowledge about space. The idea of the Mir space station emerged in the late 1970s. Having already launched a series of one-module orbital stations named Salyut, the USSR started thinking about building a multi-modular station for long-term use. On February 20, 1986, the Soviet Union successfully launched the core module into orbit, and in the 10 years that followed, 6 more modules were added to it. The core module provided the main living quarters for the astronauts, while other modules mostly contained scientific equipment. With its 7 modules, Mir weighed about 130 tons and was the largest artificial satellite in the Earth's orbit at that time. Mir was primarily used as a space laboratory for scientific research. The crew conducted about 23,000 experiments and studies in biology, physics, astronomy, and meteorology. The Mir crew also set records for the longest single stay in space. Russian astronaut Valery Polyakov lived aboard Mir for a single stay of 437 days, 17 hours, and 38 minutes. NASA astronaut Shannon Lucid set the record for women, having spent 188 days, 4 hours, and 0 minutes in orbit. The astronauts' experiences had large scientific value and contributed greatly to the biomedical studies of long-term human spaceflight. The station was also used as a place for international cooperation. Over its lifetime, Mir hosted 125 astronauts from 12 different countries, including the United States, France, Germany, and Japan. In 1995, during the collaborative space program called Shuttle Mir, the American shuttle Atlantis for the first time docked to the Mir station. It became the first U.S. spacecraft to dock with a Russian spacecraft since the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. Unfortunately, Mir's history was not only about achievement and world records. The station survived multiple accidents, including a fire and a collision with the Progress supply vehicle that threatened the crew's safety. Due to a number of dangerous accidents as well as technical and financial reasons, Mir was deorbited in March 2001. Most of the station's parts burned in the Earth's atmosphere. The unburned fragments fell into the spacecraft cemetery in the southern Pacific Ocean. Although Mir is no longer functioning, it made a great contribution to the progress of the world's space science. The station's modular design formed the technological basis of its immediate successor, the ISS. The cross-cultural collaboration that is the norm on the ISS now also started on the Mir station.
Now, isn't that fascinating about the Mir space station? So I hope you have learned a lot about the Mir space station through that short video. Now, after the Mir program, both the Russians and the Americans started the development of the ISS, or the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station is a large spacecraft in orbit around the Earth, and the ISS serves as a home where crews of astronauts and cosmonauts live. This space station or ISS is also a unique science laboratory. Several nations work together in the ISS to build and use the space station for scientific and commercial gain. And nations have contributed to the development of the ISS, including the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe. Now, just like the Mir space station, the ISS or the International Space Station is modular. So that means that the entire structure was assembled in Earth orbit. And the first piece of the ISS was launched in November of 1998. A Russian rocket launched the Russian Zarya control module. Then about 2 weeks later, the Space Shuttle Endeavour met Zarya in orbit. The Space Shuttle was carrying the US component of the ISS called Unity Node. Then the crew attached the Unity Node to the Zarya control module. So here is a photo of the Unity Node of the United States that was carried by the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and you have there the Zarya control module of the Russians. So isn't that fascinating that the ISS started with these two modules, the Unity Node and the Zarya node. Now, after the docking of the Unity node and the Zarya node, more components of the ISS were added over the next 2 years before the ISS was ready for astronauts and cosmonauts to live there. The first crew arrived on November 2 of 2000. Then astronauts and cosmonauts have lived there on the space station ever since. More pieces have been added over time. NASA and its partners from around the world completed the construction of the International Space Station in 2011. So right after its completion in 2011, the ISS is now considered as the largest or the biggest artificial satellite in orbit. And as an amateur astronomer, I'm really fascinated of this International Space Station, and I really want to observe and spot the ISS as it crosses the night sky. So, how do we find the ISS in the night sky? Now, the ISS or the International Space Station flies at an average altitude of about 248 miles. So that is equivalent to 400 kilometers above the Earth. And the ISS circles the globe every 90 minutes at a speed of about 17,500 miles per hour. That is equivalent to 28,000 kilometers per hour. So in one day, the ISS travels about the distance it would take to go from the Earth to the Moon and back. Now, isn't that fascinating, mga ka-spacers? And what is more fascinating is that the ISS can rival the brilliant planet Venus in terms of brightness. And the ISS appears as a bright moving light across the night sky. The ISS can be seen from Earth without the use of a telescope by night sky observers who knows when and where to look. And you can use several cell phone applications to find out when and where to spot the International Space Station's location. And my dear ka-spacers, I have here a sample of a cell phone app. This is known as the ISS detector. And this ISS detector is installed in my phone, and I can easily spot the ISS as it crosses the night sky. So isn't that fascinating indeed? So before we continue mga ka-spacers, again I would like to go into the details of this amazing cell phone app called the ISS detector. Now this ISS detector cell phone app is very useful to the amateur astronomer like me if you really want to spot the ISS as it crosses the night sky. So this cell phone app will give you the date, location, and time of the ISS as it crosses the night sky. And it has a radar mode, see? Ang galing. And details of the location and time, date of the ISS as it will cross the night sky. So isn't that fascinating indeed? So to continue, let us now discuss the ISS crew composition and activities. Now, the ISS generally holds crews between 3 and 6 people. The full 6-person size was possible after 2009 when the station facilities could support it. But crew size have varied over the years. So after the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster in 2003 that grounded flights for several years, crews were as small as 2 people due to the reduced capacity to launch people into the space station using the smaller Russian Soyuz spacecraft, as you could see in our photo. And eventually, the space station has also housed as many as 13 people several times, but only for a few days during crew changeovers or space shuttle visits. So naging crucial yung Space Shuttle Columbia disaster because NASA grounded all the space shuttle fleet nila. And there was no way to transport cargo and astronauts to the International Space Station but the smaller Soyuz spacecraft. So yun yung ginamit nila. So there were times that 3 lang yung astronauts on board the ISS. And when the Space Shuttle fleet retired in 2011, that left the Soyuz as the only current method to transport astronauts to the ISS. 3 astronauts fly to the space station using the Soyuz spacecraft. And they spend about 6 months there at a time. So medyo nagtagal sila doon because of the limited capacity to transport astronauts and cargo. And sometimes mission lengths vary a little due to spacecraft scheduling or special events, such as the 1-year crew that stayed on the space station between 2015 and 2016. Now, this became a problem of NASA. When the space shuttle was decommissioned, the only transport of the cosmonauts and astronauts to the International Space Station was the smaller Soyuz spacecraft. Now, for example, if something happened to the ISS, just like what was depicted in the movie Gravity, then surely the astronauts and cosmonauts must evacuate the ISS. So if the crew needs to evacuate the station, then they can return to Earth using the 2 Russian Soyuz vehicles docked to the International Space Station. So there's now a need for an alternative mode of transport to the ISS, and this is where the SpaceX comes into the picture. Now, SpaceX has been delivering cargo to and from the International Space Station since 2012. And in 2020, SpaceX began transporting people to the orbiting laboratory under NASA's Commercial Crew program. So before we continue, let's watch this very interesting video about the collaboration between NASA and SpaceX. And this video will also feature the differences between NASA being a government institution and SpaceX being a privately owned company by Elon Musk. So mga ka-spacers, let's watch this!
NASA and SpaceX have come head-to-head in recent years. But what does this mean for the future of space travel? And more importantly, are they friends or foes? Humans have been roaming planet Earth for millennia, and it's true to say we're fairly familiar with our surroundings. Despite this, over 80% of our world's oceans remain unmapped, unexplored, untouched. This may sound like an astonishing figure, but we know even less about space. Humans know less than 1% of what lies beyond our green planet, less even than a fraction of a percentage. Still, two companies come out on top as leading the way for future discoveries: NASA and SpaceX. A brief history. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was founded on the 1st of October 1958 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In signing the National Aeronautics and Space Act, Eisenhower promised that all activities in space should be devoted to peaceful purposes for the benefit of all mankind. Over a decade later, in 1969, Apollo 11 wrote history as the first successful moon landing. Decades after, and a whole millennium later, CEO Elon Musk, known also for founding electric and self-driving vehicle company Tesla, created SpaceX. This American startup envisioned one clear goal: to colonize Mars. The billionaire has, in fact, said on many occasions that human extinction on Earth would be inevitable, suggesting that colonizing another planet would help reduce the strain on our planet, which is fast running out of resources. Both companies then share a common interest in space travel. However, their ultimate goals are worlds apart, excuse the pun. While NASA's goal is to broaden mankind's knowledge and to promote discovery, SpaceX aims to utilize otherworldly resources that may help us to spread our wings one day. NASA. NASA, a government-owned and government-funded entity, arguably has more flexibility than the likes of a private company. This is because taxpayers' money can be devoted in varying proportions every year. The organization is currently best known for its International Space Station, a low Earth orbit space laboratory 408 kilometers above our heads. Traveling at a speed of 7.66 kilometers per second, more than 17,000 miles per hour, it was launched in 1998 as a joint venture between American NASA, Russian Roscosmos, Japanese JAXA, European ESA, and Canadian CSA. The multinational effort was established to further our research, while it became the first permanently manned Earth orbiting station. Today, approximately one-third of NASA's entire budget is devoted to its science arm. That involves planetary science, earth science, the study of the laws of physics and astrophysics, and heliophysics, or the study of the Sun and solar system. Other successes have included a pair of space probes referred to as Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, previously reaching as far as Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Both of these space probes have since ventured further than what was previously unthought of. In 2012, Voyager 1 entered interstellar space, an area outside of the heliosphere where the Sun's hot winds meet a colder and much denser medium. 6 years later, Voyager 2 crossed the boundary, carrying with it a first-of-its-kind instrument that will provide scientists with new types of measurements. Voyager 2 is said to be 11 billion miles away. Despite this, scientists are still able to communicate with the probe. Information sent from it, which travels at the speed of light, takes 16.5 hours to reach the Earth, while the light from the Sun takes just 8 minutes. The Artemis program envisions that man will once again land on the lunar surface by 2024, using information provided from this journey and its hundreds of other experiments to push this one giant leap forward to Mars. NASA's primary goal is to expand our knowledge on space-related matters, but in doing so, and utilizing its incredible power, 3 key educational steps are being taken much closer to home. Firstly, a research project on air quality is being carried out in conjunction with the American Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. Using a high-spectral resolution LiDAR, or HSRL for short, the duo are measuring smoke aerosols produced during wildfires, which have a devastating effect on our planet's air quality. Furthermore, research on climate change is being carried out. Currently in the learning stage, airborne radar devices are studying the flow of glaciers. While this may not propose an immediate solution, we're hoping that it will give us a glimpse of what may happen to ice masses in the future. This could potentially provide us with a time frame, helping to put pressure on companies and individuals alike to act quickly and responsibly about climate change. Finally, research about energy is being undertaken in conjunction with NASA's current space missions. The organization's space shuttle already makes use of hydrogen fuel, and the company is looking to expand hydrogen as a primary fuel source on land too, with its minimal impact on Earth's resources. SpaceX. Now we move on to SpaceX, a company in its infancy when compared to the established NASA with its multinational reach. Privately owned by Elon Musk, it's arguably harder for such a company to survive. As with all private entities, cash flow is everything, and if he fails to strike up big enough deals with the right people, then the future of his company could be in pieces. The majority of this company's revenue comes from space launches. Commercial and military satellites are proving to be very successful for the company, which, against all odds, remains a not-for-profit organization. SpaceX currently operates 2 rockets, Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. Their purposes are to transport people. Dragon, a different type of reusable cargo spacecraft, was launched into orbit by the company's Falcon 9. It's particularly beneficial owing to the fact that it is able to transport both crew and cargo, both of which can be environmentally sensitive. What that means is that people, for example, cannot survive in environments that are extremely dissimilar to what is experienced on land. We're talking oxygen, air pressure, and more. A third type of vessel, its Starship, can carry massive payloads to space and has been developed with the company's ultimate goal in mind: to colonize Mars. One day, it's believed that Starship will be able to transport people to the Red Planet to form a colony of inhabitants, expatriates. Along with the theme that SpaceX aims to utilize resources that have previously not been accessible by humans, the company recently began to launch its Starlink services, a constellation of thousands of small, mass-produced satellites that will provide planet Earth with fast, low-latency internet access, even in the most remote of places. NASA and SpaceX's interreliance. Today, SpaceX forms a crucial part of NASA's operations. In 2011, when the Space Shuttle program came to an end, the government-funded body did not have a replacement, partly due to the extraordinary costs involved. The solution, rather than to commission another company to build a fleet that it could call its own, would be to rent the work of other people. After all, why buy a car when you can commission a taxi for a journey that you take not so often? Well, the principle was the same here, and SpaceX rose to the challenge. SpaceX continued to make history. The Dragon that we discussed earlier, it took part in the first ever commercial berthing on the International Space Station, the first time any other company had interacted in such a way with NASA's work. SpaceX was also the first private company to send NASA astronauts to the International Space Station. Previously, this work had been done in-house. However, just like NASA relies on SpaceX, SpaceX wouldn't be here today without NASA. Almost a decade and a half ago, in 2006, NASA began investing in private companies, looking to outsource much of its work in favor of ultimately ending up cheaper. The American government-funded body, as a result, funded about half of the development costs for the Falcon 9 rocket, which it would later rely on. A few years later, in 2008, a multi-billion-dollar contract was awarded to Musk's company to fly cargo to the International Space Station. Over a decade later, in 2021, NASA forms a large part of the private company's revenue. The relationship between both organizations is so complex that we can only begin to describe how it works, but one saying springs to mind: you scratch my back, and I'll scratch your back. Both companies have now become so reliant on one another that it's unlikely that they are going anywhere anytime soon. The future. So what does the future hold? The duo's work is not just restricted to low Earth orbit, that's for sure. While the purposes may be vastly different, both companies share similar goals of reaching points in outer space, such as the red planet, Mars. In conjunction with NASA, SpaceX has recently been selected to design a moon lander, which will help the government-funded Artemis program reach the moon by 2024. Collaboration always ends up to be beneficial, and with cheaper and more frequent flights on the card, it only means one thing: more research will be carried out, helping both companies achieve goals of expanded knowledge and space travel. This collaboration between state-funded and privately owned is arguably the most important in space history.
Now, that is really an interesting video about the collaboration between NASA and SpaceX. And SpaceX plays a very crucial role in the transport of cargo and people to and from the International Space Station, specifically the so-called SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. Now, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft is capable of carrying up to 6,000 kilograms, that's about 13,228 pounds of cargo to the ISS, and returning 3,000 kilograms or 6,614 pounds of cargo back to Earth. Now, to date, the Dragon spacecraft has made over 20 trips to the orbiting laboratory, and it has already transported astronauts to the ISS. Now, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft was designed from the beginning to transport people. The SpaceX Dragon spacecraft is capable of carrying both NASA and commercial astronauts to destinations in low Earth orbit, and soon it will be the moon and beyond. So that's really interesting. Now, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft is carried by the Falcon 9 rocket, and it has already docked to the International Space Station. So let's watch this interesting video about this Dragon spacecraft from SpaceX and how it docked to the International Space Station. So mga ka-spacers, let's watch this!
Now, SpaceX is gearing up to do it for a third time. Its next mission to the International Space Station, known as Crew 2, is with the company's most seasoned team yet, and also its most international. Crew 2 is made up of 4 members in total: 2 NASA astronauts, Mission Commander Shane Kimbrough and pilot Megan MacArthur, and mission specialist Thomas Pesquet from ESA, as well as Aki Hoshide from JAXA. Although this will be MacArthur's first duration on the ISS, each member of the team has flown multiple times on previous missions, including the Space Shuttle and Soyuz spacecraft. Building on their collective expertise, they've been able to approach the SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule and training program with thoroughness and excitement, even if it's a little different.
So comparing the Crew Dragon with the Space Shuttle training, obviously the vehicles have a lot of differences, even though their goal is the same, to get people into low Earth orbit. With Crew Dragon, of course, we don't have those panels and panels of switches. We have a very clean wall environment.
It's like a smartphone, I would say, compared to the old telephone.
And even though the team is experienced and most of the Crew Dragon controls are automatic, it's still a brand new spacecraft with lots to get used to.
You need to know all the systems to be able to fix them, to understand how they work. You train in the sim, then you train on your spacesuit, and then you train with the scenarios from benign to more and more difficult. And at the end, you really have to, react to a fire, a launch abort, and all the contingency that could happen and that you have to be prepared for.
All this training becomes important not only for their safety, but remember, these are still early days for commercial human spaceflight.
This is only the 3rd human flight of this vehicle, right? So when we get into the range of we've flown, I don't say put a number on it, 30 to 50 times, then I think things will be more routine. I think they're all pretty much test flights still until you get a lot more data points to be able to compare. The NASA and SpaceX teams have certainly looked at what happened on Demo 2 and changed things and made it better for Crew 1. And then we're getting data from Crew 1 already on the launch side, and they're working on better fixes for that.
And SpaceX is working diligently with those changes. The Crew 2 team will actually be launching on the Crew Dragon Endeavour, which is the same one that was launched during the Demo 2 mission in May of 2020 with Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, who happens to be MacArthur's husband. How cool is that?
It's amazing to think that I will be sitting in the same seat that Bob was sitting in when he certified that vehicle the very first time that it launched. That certainly adds a little something special to the mission.
Since then, the SpaceX team has made some tweaks to Endeavour, starting with the thermal protective system, adding some new parachutes, and increasing the propellant on the pad abort system. The extra fuel will improve the safety systems of the capsule, which allow it to launch off the Falcon 9 rocket and maneuver itself away if there's an emergency. Crew 2 will launch out of NASA's Kennedy Space Center and will be in orbit for about a day before it docks with the ISS. And when it does, it will be filled with 11 people in total. Crew 2 and Crew 1 will be aboard the station at the same time. Although it will be a cramped space lasting roughly a week, the crews are taking advantage of the extra set of hands. They'll start conducting scientific research such as ultrasound testing and watching cotton grow in microgravity. The crew will also be responsible for installing the station's new solar arrays, which will increase the station's total power from 160 to 215 kilowatts. Crew 2 will be able to return home in 6 months. A flight like this from the 3 space agencies hasn't been made in 20 years. It may not seem like a big deal, but international collaborations like these are important.
It makes things more complicated. Yeah, we don't speak the same language. We don't have those same priorities all the time, but in the end, it makes you better. It makes you achieve more.
Looking ahead to Moon and Mars, I think we need to continue this international cooperation because a single country just cannot do it alone.
It's also true on this global level that we have these big dreams where we look out, to the horizon and this desire to explore the universe around us, and we're always going to be more successful when we work together with our international partners to achieve these incredible dreams.
For more
So mga ka-spacers, isn't that fascinating about the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft? The SpaceX Dragon spacecraft was designed to take astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Now, the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft is carried by the Falcon 9 rocket. Now, the Falcon 9 rocket has a height of about 70 meters, and the Falcon 9, mga ka-spacers, is a reusable two-stage rocket designed and manufactured by SpaceX for the reliable and safe transport of astronauts and payload into Earth orbit and beyond. The Falcon 9, mga ka-spacers, is the world's first orbital class reusable rocket. For reusability, mga ka-spacers, will allow SpaceX to refly the most expensive parts of the Falcon 9, which in turn, mga ka-spacers, will drive down the cost of space access. So ang galing, isn't that fascinating indeed? And upon reaching orbital speeds, the Falcon 9, the first stage of the Falcon 9 will separate from the Dragon spacecraft. And what is so fascinating, mga ka-spacers, is that that first stage will return to Earth and it will land gently on a specific landing platform. Ang galing, di ba? Super ang galing talaga netong Falcon 9. And eventually, the Dragon spacecraft will intercept the ISS. Now, the Dragon spacecraft is capable of carrying up to 7 passengers to and from Earth orbit and beyond. It is the only spacecraft currently flying that is capable of returning significant amounts of cargo to Earth and is the first private spacecraft to take humans to the space station. Alright, mga ka-spacers, and eventually, upon meeting with the ISS, the Dragon spacecraft will eventually dock to the International Space Station. So, at this point, mga ka-spacers, let us now zoom in on the major parts of the International Space Station and some of the challenges that the astronauts must overcome as they live and work in the International Space Station. Now, the first Russian modules included basic systems needed for the space station to function. They also provided living areas for crew members. Now, the modules called nodes connect the parts of the station to each other. So here is a sample of a module that connects the other parts of the International Space Station. And also, the space station is powered by the sun. And there are solar panels that are attached to the ISS. Now, stretching out to the sides of the space station are the solar panels or the solar arrays. These arrays collect energy from the sun to provide electrical power. The arrays are connected to the station with a long truss. On the truss are radiators that controls the space station's temperature. Alright, so here are some photos of the interior of the ISS. Okay, so fascinating indeed. Now, for the life support on board the ISS, the air and the water are filtered and recycled. So there is a complex filtration mechanism on board the ISS that allows the air and the water to be filtered and recycled. So isn't that fascinating, mga ka-spacers? Now, what about taking a bath in the International Space Station? Now, in order to clean the hair, astronauts use a shampoo that is designed to stay in the hair without being washed out Now, to clean the hair, the astronauts use the shampoo just like they would any other kind of shampoo. Only there is no lather and there is no rinse kasi nga nagtitipid sila sa tubig. Alright, so fascinating mga ka-spacers. So mga ka-spacers, di ba very exciting talaga ang makapunta sa International Space Station. Kung ako nga po, ako'y nangangarap na makapunta sa ISS. But the problem is that prolonged stay in the International Space Station has an effect on the human body, especially the effects of microgravity. Now, humans are susceptible to a wide range of physiological degradation as time in weightlessness goes on. So, itong microgravity ay nakakaapekto sa mga astronauts sa ISS. Specifically, bone loss. Microgravity is not beneficial to the astronaut on board the ISS because microgravity will lead to bone loss. About 12% of your bone density will decrease as you stay in the ISS for a long period of time. And also your body fluids will shift upward. So hindi rin po beneficial ang microgravity. Due to microgravity, your fluids, yung dugo po ng astronaut, will shift away from legs and up towards the head. So hindi po maganda yan sa functioning ng ating katawan. So ang ginagawa ng mga astronauts on board the ISS is that they do frequent exercise. So nag-exercise po sila on board the International Space Station para maging balance po yung body fluids nila and malabanan po nila yung decrease in bone density. So that's what they do in the International Space Station. So they have to do frequent exercising to alleviate bone loss and para yung mga body fluids nila ay more or less ma-distribute sa katawan ng mga astronauts. Now, another thing that must be considered while living inside the International Space Station would be the isolation and the cramped living conditions inside the ISS. So mga ka-spacers, just to give you an idea of how it feels to be living inside the ISS, so try to imagine this. So imagine living inside of your house for months without ever stepping foot outside or even opening a window. So ganyan po kahirap ang mamuhay sa loob ng International Space Station. So you would feel isolated, malayo ka sa mga mahal nyo sa buhay. So anyway, there are means for them to communicate with their loved ones and they can communicate with mission control at NASA. Alright, and also in addition to this isolation, astronauts will be wearing the same pair of underwear for months at a time and putting on a diaper every time they go for a walk in their spacesuits. And suddenly, this romantic notion of living in the International Space Station begins to sound more like living in a nursing home for the elderly. So, mahirap po talaga ang mamuhay sa loob ng International Space Station. But still, the International Space Station is important. Now, why? Now, the space station has made it possible for people to have an ongoing presence in space. Human beings have been living in space every day since the first crew arrived. The International Space Station's laboratories also will allow crew members to do research that could not be done anywhere else. This scientific research benefits people on Earth. Alright mga ka-spacers, so before we conclude this talk about the International Space Station, let's watch this interesting video about living inside the International Space Station. Okay mga ka-spacers, let's watch this!
Ever wondered what it's like to work in space? The brave men and women of the International Space Station are truly a special breed, but at the end of the day, they're just regular people going about their jobs. So join us today as we shadow our higher-ups and learn all about a day in the life of an ISS astronaut. When hurtling around planet Earth at 17,100 miles per hour, standard human notions of day and night start to look pretty silly. In a normal 24-hour stretch, a typical ISS astronaut will see the sun rise and set 16 times in total. Human bodies did not evolve that way, so a regular 24-hour Earth day is maintained up there, if nothing else to prevent the crew descending into a grim spiral of permanent crippling jet lag. And while it might seem from the internet that all they do up there is strum guitars and make funny videos, in fact, astronauts' schedules are rigorously itemized down to 5-minute increments by an ops planning team working at mission control. The day usually runs from 6 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., pegged to UTC, which is basically the same thing as Greenwich Mean Time. Anyway, let's start the day. Lights go on at 6 a.m. Astronauts will typically still be in their sleeping bags, which are affixed to the walls of their telephone box-sized cabins to stop them bobbing about. Before they get up, not that up or down have much meaning on the ISS, crew might read emails, digest the news online, or check any overnight missions sent across from Mission Control. First things first, a hop in the shower, right? Well, no. The best astronauts can hope for hygiene-wise, despite working out twice a day, is to squirt a pouch of warm water and a trace of soap onto a washcloth to rub themselves down with. Longer-haired crewmates like to use a special rinseless shampoo applied to their scalp and rubbed vigorously through with a towel. This requires very little water and was developed for hospital patients who can't shower. At least you never need a hairdryer. There's even a specially adapted hair-cutting machine called the Flowbee, essentially a pair of clippers attached to a vacuum cleaner, which prevents stray stubble from floating away and clogging up vital ISS hardware. Toothbrushing is broadly similar to the process on Earth, and astronauts are even allowed to bring up their own preferred brand of toothpaste. The main drawback is, with no sinks or running water, astronauts pretty much have to swallow at the end. It's time to get dressed. Astronauts usually wear casual short-sleeve t-shirts, as the temperature aboard remains a constant 72 to 73 degrees and there's rarely any reason to get dolled up or wear a jumper. They change their clothes as seldom as possible, often wearing the same items for days at a time. This is because there isn't much storage space and certainly no washing facilities on the station. After a few days, the smellier items are stashed in a mesh bag, ready for the next resupply mission to dispatch to a spectacular fiery death on re-entry, hopefully having brought fresh supplies beforehand. Inevitably, even in space, nature calls. As you might expect, visiting the bathroom in a microgravity environment throws up an assortment of grim challenges. For liquid waste, each crew member is issued with a personal urinal funnel they attach to a fan-driven vacuum hose. This fan sucks any and all liquids away, whisking just next door where, alongside moisture condensated from the air, their wee is broken down by electrolysis to generate fresh oxygen and make the next batch of drinking water. Solid waste has its own wholly separate system. Well, it's the same fan. Feces are sucked away into a wastewater tank and sealed in a plastic bag. It's considered good etiquette, by the way, for astronauts to at least try and remember to leave a fresh bag for the next crew person. Unlovely as this setup is, it's a vast improvement on older space stations' orbital facilities. On the now defunct Russian space station Mir, a power failure once forced cosmonauts to defecate directly into emergency plastic bags until a repair could be made. Morale is said to have suffered badly. Anyway, let's go to breakfast. Toast is definitely a no-no on the space station, as are sandwiches, because crumbs are a disaster in zero-gravity environments. Not only are they messy, but if left to float away unchecked, they get lodged in tiny crevices and encourage the growth of fungus. There are no conventional fridges, although a company called BioServe Space Technologies is trialing a substitute aboard right now. But there's plenty to eat nonetheless, like scrambled egg, oatmeal or waffles. True, much of it is dehydrated, brought to life with warm water, but there's also lemonade, coffee or tea, so long as you don't mind drinking through a straw, of course. After breakfast, part of a rigorously planned diet that's carefully monitored by nutritionists, it's time for a crew call to Mission Control to go over the plan for the day. Nearly every single task on the ISS is carefully scripted, and astronauts have their activities planned in step-by-step fashion down to the finest detail. Some of the most important duties involve maintenance, both preventative tasks carried out before things go wrong and the corrective approach once something's actually broken. Cleaning filters is important, as is the disinfection of surfaces, updating computer software, and even taking out the trash, which usually goes into the Russia-launched Progress service vehicle. On occasion, the crew's maintenance duties will require a spacewalk. This can be for jobs as apparently mundane as changing batteries on the exterior of the station, but still necessitate 4 hours just to suit up and a 100-page checklist to run through. In case you're wondering, yes, there's a diaper in there. Typically, the crew move through the interior of the ISS using an array of handrails which are situated at intervals on every surface. It's said that during extended missions, astronauts' calluses vanish from the base of their feet but reappear on the top, because this is suddenly a very crucial body part for keeping them upright and steady. As well as those handrails, surfaces in the ISS are usually adorned with strips of Velcro. This is to help stop handheld tools, pens and other items from drifting away and getting lost, sometimes for frustratingly long periods. After a solid morning of work, often in solitary roles but sometimes teaming up with colleagues across the Russian-English language divide using a dialect astronauts affectionately refer to as Runglish, it's time for lunch. While the days of the week make even less sense than the difference between night and day in space, the ISS crews still maintain a distinction between weekdays and weekends and share a ritual meal together as a team on Sunday. Weightlessness creates issues for everything aboard the ISS, and cooking is no exception. Convection, the heating principle on which most Earth-based ovens run, doesn't work in orbit. Hence, most meals are prepared from dehydrated ingredients and hot water. This is also to prevent fungus from taking hold amid moist stored foodstuffs. Some food items, beefsteak for instance, come pre-sterilized with ionizing radiation, which helps prevent spoilage. Condiments like ketchup, mustard or hot chili are all available to spice things up, as are salt and pepper, albeit in liquid form so the granules don't drift away and cause havoc with station operations. Deliveries of fresh food such as fruit happen periodically throughout the year. Takeaways aren't really an option, except for back in 2001 when Pizza Hut memorably sent a family-sized salami pizza on a Russian rocket as part of a $1 million marketing stunt. Mission Control is keenly aware of the importance of fresh supplies to the morale of the hard-working ISS crew. After washing their hands, with disinfectant wipes because remember, there's no sink, it's straight back to work. The main mission for the ISS team is to conduct scientific experiments and further mankind's understanding of life in space. So the most important and exciting work they'll do is essentially in the role of lab technicians, guided in their actions by scientists on the ground. And the ISS is positively bristling with labs. Russia has 2 mini-research modules. The US lab is called Destiny. Columbus is run by the European Space Agency. The most recent lab is Japan's Kaibo, which includes a special platform allowing experiments to take place outside the station. Just some of the questions being explored concern the effects of low gravity on living cells, artificial materials, and even miniature explosions. A veritable menagerie of animals, from mice to ants to fish to worms, often participate, but it's fair to say the most regular experimental subjects are the astronauts themselves. As such, they need to stay in good shape, so when all that scientific work is done, it's time to work out. Each crew member is required, as part of their duties, to work out for at least 2 and sometimes more hours every day. Partly this is because gravity on Earth naturally keeps human beings' bones and muscles in good condition as they are constantly working to keep us upright. But in space, muscles atrophy and bones grow brittle unless constantly worked. Astronauts also work out to combat the dreaded space snuffles, an unlovely condition where bodily fluids, no longer lugged downward by gravity, accumulate in the head. In order to stay trim and clear-minded, astronauts make use of 3 main pieces of gym equipment specially designed and calibrated for life on board. There's an exercise bike, which doesn't have a seat because you don't need one in zero gravity. There's also a treadmill onto which crew are secured with bungee straps. It has a clever vibration isolation system built in, so astronauts' heavy footfall can't disturb the delicate science going on elsewhere on the ISS. The third main piece of workout equipment is the so-called Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARED. The most recent addition to the ISS onboard gym, ARED uses clever vacuum-sealed cylinders to mimic resistance up to 600 pounds as an alternative to lifting heavy weights. If you're wondering how astronauts cope with the sheer tedium of pumping iron for 2 hours every day, while teams on the ground monitor their vital signs and provide coaching, don't worry. There are screens for watching movies and even scope to get competitive. In 2012, a NASA athlete named Sunita Williams competed in the Malibu Triathlon, using ARED as a makeshift swimming simulator. What's your excuse? After an evening meal, which can sadly taste a little bland as aroma doesn't really work in low gravity and blood surges to the sinuses thanks to those space snuffles we mentioned, it's time to unwind before bed. The ISS does have Wi-Fi, clocking in at an impressive 600 megabits per second via the Tetris satellite system, so astronauts can and do spend a lot of time online. Many choose to phone home. There's also the station's beautiful cupola, surely the ultimate vantage point for just sitting and watching the world go by. At night, astronauts return to their sleeping bags. These bags have special armholes so users keep restrained but can still type or read a book. Some issues to overcome with catching 40 winks include the ISS's constant humming noise. It's been compared to a constantly running vacuum cleaner. Earplugs, it's said, help out a lot. Another more disturbing consideration for dozing astronauts is airflow. Experienced crewmates try to align themselves at night with the station air vents. This is because warm air doesn't rise in space, so sleeping astronauts in poorly ventilated sections can wake up gasping for air, surrounded by an invisible bubble of their own exhaled carbon dioxide. At the very least, this causes splitting headaches. Once they eventually drift off, seasoned astronauts are even said to dream in zero gravity. Oh, and despite everything else that's different up there, snoring is apparently still very much a thing. What do you think?
Now that is really interesting about the life inside the International Space Station. I hope you would realize, mga ka-spacers, the importance of having a space station such as the International Space Station. And would you believe, mga ka-spacers, that NASA is currently working on a plan to explore other worlds like Mars, Europa, and Titan. The International Space Station is one of the first steps. NASA will use the lessons learned on the space station to prepare for human missions that reach farther into space than ever before. Well, I guess that's about it for this episode of COSMOQUEST, a podcast about the space station. So sana mga ka-spacers, marami po kayong natutunan about the development of the space station, lalong-lalo na po yung International Space Station. So sana nagustuhan niyo po ang ating episode ngayong gabi. So don't forget mga ka-spacers to like and share this episode of COSMOQUEST para makarating sa maraming tao, lalong-lalo na po yung mga estudyante, so that we could inspire them to be engaged in the sciences. Kasi yun po ang kailangan natin ngayon. We need more scientists, we need more engineers, we need more medical doctors, we need men and women of science. So pakikalat lang po ang ating episode para ma-inspire natin yung mga kabataan to be engaged in the sciences. And don't forget to follow us on our Facebook page, the Bedan Society of Young Astronomers. Don't forget also to follow us on our Facebook page, the Sky Watchers Society of Las Piñas. And don't forget to follow me on my Facebook page, the Science Guy Ka-Spacers channel. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Science Guy Professor John Cajigal. And bilang tulong niyo po sa amin, para mapagpatuloy po namin yung aming advocacy to spread the good news of science and technology. So hanggang dito na lang po tayo mga ka-spacers. This is your ka-spacer and Space Commander, Professor John Cajigal, saying live long and prosper. And don't forget mga ka-spacers to always keep your space. Alright, so see you in our next episode of COSMOQUEST, a podcast. Stay safe mga ka-spacers. Bye-bye!
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone.